Part of Magic being the greatest game is that it also has to contain some ideas that are polarizing. The enticing premise of the collectible or trading card game as a genre is that you can customize your approach somewhat and maybe express or at least focus in on something you find especially compelling. So then it has to be that there are more or less appealing ways to deal with the game for each individual player, myself included. And I don't refer here to the most recent objects of discourse like Universes Beyond or the shift away from standard and eternal 1v1 60 card constructed toward EDH as the default version of a game of Magic the Gathering, but instead to the long established conventions of Magic and like games of cards. Either gameplay and design standards like the various points on the strategy circle, or the identities of colors, or just how certain cards look and feel. I'm talking about how you, as an individual player, place yourself in that mess of choices and how it defines your gaming identity. I'm talking about how someone might consider themselves to be a control player or a Golgari mage or a Vorthos, but defining oneself in this way means there's, too, some inversion of our ideals, the point across from us on the color wheel, the death and taxes to our storm. In Magic, these sorts of conflicts dominate especially in the casual discussion of the game, where players might hold a more or less joking sense that there really is something improper about playing with like a bunch of counterspells, and where those counterspell players might embrace that role of villainy. I think this is in particular very helpful for people who are still buying their way into the game, that there is an opportunity to establish a distinct profile for yourself as a player and to put that in opposition to other players. It makes it all feel much more social and personal and satisfying, and in my experience, this gets replaced with just a general satisfaction with regard to understanding the game in a deep way and having a strong knowledge of the cards and mechanics, and maybe the lore if that's your thing. When I started playing Magic, my favorite color was green, and honestly that's just because I was a child and green was my favorite visual color, which it still is, but I still held on to a special love for and association with the ideals of green Magic for years and years after. But truthfully, my concerns with the game have been so far removed from just liking a specific color for so long that I don't even feel right claiming it anymore, and I don't think I rightfully could have done so for quite some time now. But I do have other likes and dislikes that are more or less integral or ancillary to the game, so let me try to define for you and myself also what exactly my identity is as a Magic player right now. As I mentioned, I don't identify really strongly with a particular color or guild or whatever. In fact, I'm most invigorated playing 3 to 5 color decks. I like finding odd and tricky and unexpected intersections between different cards and archetypes. Nearly all of my favorite retail draft formats have common dual lands to give you a sense of what kind of decks I want to play most of the time. And I think this is mostly to do with that I don't like having a highly defined strategy. I repel from linear decks usually. Like, I'll do it if that's what it takes to win in an environment with stakes, but in any casual setting, I usually want to be playing something flexible and adjusting to the game rather than imposing my will on it. Especially, I don't enjoy playing out decks that are primarily trying to combo, particularly really long, involved single-turn combos like Storm. In Cube, my favorite format, it's generally my feeling that combo decks are bad, and in EDH I feel a bit of an ass making 3 other players watch me sigh and grunt and flip around cards for like 5 minutes before deciding I can in fact win. Let's speak next in the familiar terms of Wizards of the Coast's player profile language. From that perspective, I'm like a nuts and bolts Spike and a Melvin. Apart from EDH with my friends, I pretty much only play competitive limited, and I also love learning about and practicing mechanical game design and how I build my decks and cubes. So, another aspect of the game I am sort of at odds with is narrative and theme. And I don't mean I can't appreciate a flavorful and resonant card design. I certainly get a kick when everything aligns like that, but I more mean that I never ever build a cube or a deck toward maximizing these qualities. Even when I'm not trying to be competitive, I just care a lot more about the mechanics of the game because it's my favorite game more than it's my favorite anything else. And another aspect of Magic that just totally icks me out is the collectability thing, and how that manifests recently in huge numbers of variant printings. Even before that was the case, I never much cared for foils, but now that we have sometimes 5 or more versions of a single card released with its initial printing, I've been radicalized in my demand for the basic. In almost every case now seeking out the frill-less first print. And there are some truly gorgeous individual cards among these endless variants, like when I was building the Kalia deck described in my previous video, I learned of RK Post's World Gorger Dragon variant from Dominaria Remastered, which is I think one of the most breathtaking pure MTG aesthetic slices of cardboard. It's an absolute no contest naming Post's World Gorger as the most evocative and rich and best looking version, but I still chose to play the dorky Blue Eyes derivative original by Wayne England, because that's World Gorger to me. And that Magic historical canon matters to me because I want liking this game to mean something, as embarrassing as that might sound. I want there to be sacred symbols, especially if that status can be disentangled somewhat from just market forces. The ability for a group of players to collectively, unspeakingly, and instantly understand the meaning of a given card as a game piece by way of its aesthetic form is valuable, like pulses syncing around a piece of music. When I just noted the remarkable compositional similarity of Wayne England's World Gorger Dragon, and also his Stone Tongue Basilisk, but who cares about that card for any reason other than it sort of looks like World Gorger, and Kazuki Takahashi's Blue Eyes White Dragon, it was not for simply curiosity's sake. Since it is my contention Yu-Gi-Oh! Has achieved the manner of card iconography I'm describing more totally than any other game. In part, this is due to the brighter, more graphic card arts, but more than that, it's so because of the anime/manga's ability to describe a holistic vision for the world of Yu-Gi-Oh!, and because it was defined by a single artist. I think this is a significant part of why Yu-Gi-Oh! Chooses to/is able to rely a lot on so-called retrain cards, which reinscribe Takahashi's initial suite of characters and symbols. Because those first few glimpses of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Held such a power to those who beheld them with brains young and ready for the era of Big Shield Gardna, being an emotional lodestone equivalent to like how the Virgin Mary is for Catholic grandmas. World Gorger Dragon was first printed in Magic's Odyssey block, the set's release dates for which neatly straddle the arrival of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime and then card game in America. It's unknowable if Wayne England was instructed to make his dragon look like the Blue Eyes, or if he took it upon himself, or if this is merely an episode of England's artistic subconscious being infiltrated by the beyond. But there is an undeniable power to the undeniable fact that this card looks like the Blue Eyes. Mr. England sadly passed away in 2016, but I attempted to contact Magic's art director from the time Odyssey block released, Dana Knutson, to ask if he might shed some light on this fantasy artistical convergence. But my message still awaits a response, and so no stronger conclusion may be drawn at this time. But back to the issue at hand, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a foundationally visual work, with the game having to be later cobbled together based on the loose rules that a mangaka thought would help him tell his visual story. Magic is primarily a mechanical work, one of brilliant game design, and the aesthetic elements of the game typically serve to express the mechanics. The two are mirrors of each other, and in this sense the aesthetic content of Magic cards is somewhat arbitrary, and why the game was so eager and ready to have made for it cards that depict other universes beyond the creations original to the game. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is conversely defined primarily by aesthetics, and the mechanics are an extension of those aesthetics rather than the other way around. Think about it like this. The majority of new Magic products in the coming year are these Fortnite crossover events now, and this takes its toll in a number of ways as far as the game being an enduring cultural work, but the game is still just getting more and more popular and is still essentially giving players what they want by just exploring the mechanical possibilities further. But could you even make a custom Yu-Gi-Oh! Card in the style of Universes Beyond that didn't basically look like a joke in a much more profound way than even the most hardline Magic purist would regard a Spider-Man in their game? That feeling of discordance to the point of humor is exactly because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is its aesthetic, and everything else about the game as a game emerges from that. So the idea of something outside that aesthetic expressing itself in the same way mechanically is ridiculous. And I don't think it would shock anyone for me to congratulate Magic on having what is almost definitely higher quality artwork than Yu-Gi-Oh! Or really any other card game for that matter, but this is because the game has a lot of ground to make up in terms of immediately gripping players with something aesthetic. What I'm describing as the success of Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't the success of the card illustrations as art divorced from their being on cards, but how effectively the aesthetic profile of the card as an object, art and all, becomes synonymous with the meaning of the card as a game piece. This is where Yu-Gi-Oh! And specifically the style of Kazuki Takahashi's original artwork from the manga, and thus also the initial suite of actual card arts informed heavily by his style, flourished. And in a lot of cases, because Takahashi was working quick and tiny across manga panels, he had no choice but to rely on brave, bold, symbolic card arts, with the subjects positioned stiffly and silhouetted harshly. There's little background or context around the subjects to speak of in these early Yu-Gi-Oh! Card arts. Surely Magic has the better art to look at as art, but what is the better looking card when we understand the card as a utilitarian object? I got this copy of Defense of the Heart recently, which features the work of GOAT MTG artist Rebecca Gay, and based on what I've said so far, it probably doesn't surprise that I wanted the original artwork, but different from World Gorger Dragon, I do firmly believe that this DOTH is absolutely the best art available for the card. But what exactly is being illustrated here? As best I can surmise, there's this sort of tree folk in the middle conversing with this robed mage, presumably discussing the terms for defending the heart, whatever that is, and behind them are these elves who seem to be in some kind of hurry to, I don't know, defend the heart? It looks beautiful, and part of that beauty is the question and mystique that comes from only getting this glimpse at what appears to be a rich and fully realized world. But it's undeniably very dense, and you couldn't really blame players for not really getting what they're supposed to get out of it. I have an art degree and I've read a few books, and I don't know what's going on, so what chance does the average American stand? But the mystical elf from Yu-Gi-Oh! On the other hand, what can you say about it that isn't in the name of the card? And yeah, I'm tipping the scales a little with the specific examples I chose here, but between traditional playing cards with their essential look and the rich illustrations of Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards are somewhere in the middle. Takahashi had the privilege to illustrate his card subjects in detail far beyond what the card itself presents, to show us what exactly that little artwork stands in for. But Magic has to pack every bit of the card, every bit of necessary storytelling, into the card itself. Magic cards appear to us as something we must investigate and then shortcut on our own. Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, however, come to us already as their most essential selves. So Magic already struggles a bit in this instant gut punch iconography, but so that gets just so much worse when you start incorporating all these alt art, secret layer, galaxy foil BS type treatments that can even look absolutely nothing at all like a Magic card and basically only serve as game pieces by divine decree. And besides aesthetic sensibility, this does have a real cost when you are having people primarily play this game in a multiplayer setting, since there's already going to be so much to keep track of, and having an innate ability to recognize and understand at least most of the stuff your opponents are playing becomes actually an essential skill. I'm really critical of the idea of self-expression as its own end, in even creative projects, and as far as expressing the self as a consumer of a card game, I will comfortably chuckle aghast. I want to play the cards that are the same cards as other players' cards, the same cards that have embedded in them all our decades of experience as Magic players. There's a weight to this reanimate, but not this one. But this is increasingly the status quo for Magic. The cards will be more complex and divergent both mechanically and aesthetically, and there will be more different versions that are more or less available for this or that reason, and consequently less and less consensus over what, for example, an Eternal Witness looks like. So I can refute it all I want and glorify my pure hoops version of playing Magic cards, but when am I just crafting for myself a distinct aesthetic bubble and pretending that's any different from what I condemn now? Well, the centerpiece of this video is the idea that I might try to square this circle by leveraging these aspects of Magic I find discordant to my ideal aesthetic gaming experience to instead promote that vision, to project it to those around me and unify those gamers around it. Magic is, at day's end, a game, a deck-building game, so all the ideas I'm bandying about have to take form as part of the game eventually for this to make any sense at all. And right now, my goal is going to be to make something that takes all these things I dislike in Magic and puts them to some kind of purpose. Everything I hate pushed together until it collapses into a glorious expression of celebration for the game. So let me state clearly the criteria based on my tastes, defined so far. First, I have to make this an EDH deck because there's so much I dislike about that format on principle, and it represents so much this disunity of Magic, the splintering of the player base, and the vanishing of the version of romantic, idealized Magic that the pure commodified form emerges from now. Second, this deck has to have some kind of defined theme and narrative arc. This is going to be more of an experiential storytelling project than an investigation of card interactions. Third, I have to use at least some odd, non-standard, premium card versions in order to help tell that story. And fourth, in terms of gameplay, this deck has to be really linear and involve an obnoxiously lengthy combo. Hopefully I can tick some other boxes on aspects of the game I dislike along the way, but I think this is a strong start, so let's get to work. Before I started writing this video, I had toyed with a list for Isu the Abominable. This was basically a low-power lands deck, since that's an archetype I've always been fond of, but it's hard to build is not really frustrating for casual play, since lands are just so hard to interact with, especially the way that Wizards is now explicitly restricting land destruction in EDH below bracket 4. So I thought I might hamstring it by tying it up with the snow theme and this really slow and underwhelming commander. Separately, my friend Jeff had been working on an Umari Spellslinger deck, and we had thrown around the idea of Beledros Witherbloom as a potential alternate commander. Then it occurred to me how Beledros is another potential big mana lands commander who has this exact dynamic of creating a single huge go-off combo turn that you're just building up to. As for the question of how you survive up to that point, has about another gameplay dynamic I hate, Group Hug. Gladly, there are plenty of symmetrical land and mana stacking abilities in green that will eventually pay off with the commander. So this is the spine of the deck right here: Veteran Explorer, Rootweaver Druid, Clear the Land, Tempt with Discovery, and those ram cards are then topped off with symmetrical mana doublers like Heartbeat of Spring, Keeper of Progenitus, and Dictate of Karametra. These play really nicely with Beledros' untap ability, but that only fires off once a turn, so here are some ways to stack and repeat that. Magus of the Candelabra and Root Awakening let me untap my lands as well, and then I have some creature sacrifice effects like Disciple of Bolas that will let me kill and recast Beledros to get another untap activation. So from this position, what's the most convoluted and not deterministic way I can try to win with an obscene but not infinite amount of mana? Probably it's to take a bunch of extra turns, but we're in black-green, so that narrows the possibilities pretty drastically. Mindslaver is pretty perfect, but beyond that, it's like Seed Time, I guess, which is clearly too restrictive to count on for a primary win con. Worst Fears and Rise of the Eldrazi sadly both exile themselves, and Emrakul the Promised End can work, but it will require having more sacrifice effects. Temporal Extortion is a very cool design, but it's pretty bad for recasting because it gets worse the less life the opponents have to pay. There are some stragglers like Magistrate's Scepter, but they all require a lot of additional work to get going. I think Mindslaver really has to be it, and luckily we do have plenty of recursion and tutor effects in black-green, so we can make the most of that one card. Mindslaver turns pretty respectable once you start looping it with a variety of regrowth effects. And Mindslaver also seems like a wonderful and poetic inversion of the group hug dynamic, where the resources I've accumulated for the opponents then become their undoing. Between this and the flavor of the regrowth effects, which often refer to natural cycles of renewal, as well as the tutors, which often deal with discovery and recovery of knowledge, I think I'm developing my deck's theme as something about time and remembrance, about nostalgia and beginnings and endings, about the game I love changing in unmistakable ways and the effort to keep my version of it alive, the flourish and bounty under the looming shadow of death. face up on the table from before the game even starts. So that has to be pretty perfect, right? To have the endgame of this deck be to lock in on the memories that keep us returning compulsively and involuntarily to this game for decades, embodied in the cardboard. As I was writing this, I noticed for the first time that Beledros is in fact an Elder Dragon. Of course, the type line for the original headlining creatures of the Elder Dragon Highlander format, which became the Commander format we know today. How fitting that this card should refer to the halcyon days of the format prior to its being exploited and marketized to the detriment of the broader game of Magic. What was once our way of breathing life into the forgotten bulk binned rares of mere curiosity by making them the basis for casual break from the tournament grind, to accentuate the camaraderie built in those perverse dens of FNM, PTQ, RCQ, LSV, GP, pre-release PVDDR, Game Day, SCG Open, etc., instead turned into destroy all else in the Magic world, and for what? The answer, maybe, is that we have finally severed Magic the product from Magic the game. I've gone through a mourning period, maybe several mourning periods, with regard to the transformation Magic has undergone in the past decade-ish, with the rise of Secret Lair and collector boosters and universes beyond, and all else reliably bemoaned by internet users who haven't grasped the cost of doing business, except those who reliably celebrate it because maybe they can't understand someone having a non-marketized relationship to a cultural item. What I mean is that there is a coherent perspective by which the measurable and quantifiable success of the Magic the Gathering that Wizards of the Coast makes doesn't matter, but also that to imagine the trajectory we are witnessing as anything but capitalist determinism is wishful thinking. And so that's not to say put up and shut up, instead it's to say it is written and has been for some time. This realization does immensely drain and reconfigure your individual bond to the game in the short term. At least that's my experience. If it survives, though, what's waiting is the totalizing sensation of freedom that the game simply is. And it has already died thousands of times and will keep dying again and again. The get back is that you're allowed to stop holding funerals every day. As I'm writing this portion of the video, a recently stirred disagreement among EDH players is the question of whether hybrid mana cards should be allowed in decks of either color represented in their casting costs, rather than being restricted as they currently are to decks of both colors. The Distraction Makers made an excellent video describing the reasons why allowing hybrid mana actually creates more design space and decision points than otherwise. The important takeaway from their video is that hybrid mana cards functioning as such creates more and different kinds of restrictions. It does not abolish restrictions. In the most extreme cases where restrictions are circumvented by like a Rhystic study that costs a hybrid blue and white, you aren't saving yourself from anything because WotC is telling you they would print this card in mono blue and mono white individually. Even if the community succeeds in preserving the current ruling through force of will, you are still playing the game designed by WotC, and they can just print a white Rhystic study if they care to. The utility of hybrid is that when a cost is largely made of hybrid symbols, it's easy for those mono white and mono blue and strict blue white decks to cast something like Dovescape, but it is actually really hard for a blue black green deck to cast it. Isn't it just much more interesting if you have the option to cast all sorts of things, but you just have to make trade-offs for all of them? Hybrid mana functioning as such creates another point where you have to make a trade-off for playing lots of colors and where you are rewarded for focusing on a few colors. I really recommend listening to the Distraction Makers argument in their own words, regardless of your stance on the issue, but I wanted to talk about it from another perspective that isn't really about whether or not it's good or agreeable game design. Because I've recently been doing the intellectual self-harm of reading Reddit threads about this topic, and I've been struck that it seems like the deeper into the discussion it gets and the more people go back and forth, the closer they get to saying that really their objection to this proposed change is just total discomfort with WotC changing anything about the fundamental rules of the format because they don't trust the company to make those choices. And from a certain perspective, this is unprecedented because the main innovation WotC has brought to Commander since taking over management of the format, the bracket system, is more of a descriptive tool meant to explain the different ways that people do play Commander more than it is meant to prescribe how people should play. There are a lot of silly rules in the bracket system about combos and mass land denial, and I don't know how much the WotC designers personally care about these issues from the perspective of game design, but the restrictions exist because those things are already culturally taboo in the format, dating back to before WotC had any involvement with it. So in that sense, a change to hybrid mana would represent a new level of intervention in the format philosophy, at least theoretically, and maybe I would care about that, except the EDH did not have any management coherent enough to be described as a philosophy until this point. Or if it did, it hasn't had a perceptible presence in the version of the format that anyone who cares about hybrid mana being changed has played for a very long time. Because wasn't the spirit of Commander to play like Solemn Simulacrum in every deck? Wasn't the spirit to play a bunch of 7-mana bulk rares? I want you to look at the deck lists that the people who formalized the rules for this format played with. That is the spirit of Commander. Does that look anything like a deck you've played recently? Some players are unduly frustrated with the idea of this hybrid mana rules change because it reveals that the format has already changed and will continue to change in fundamental ways. To the extent that there is a spirit of the format, that spirit is practiced only probably by people who are too disconnected from discourse about a card game's rules to have any opinion on these changes. And so those who are invested in EDH, I guess, sometimes feel like a sort of paternalistic vanguard to those misguided, noble, and naive players we imagine, maybe sometimes as like a past version of ourselves, who cannot be trusted to decide for themselves why and how the cards are fun to play with, except for when we give them written consent to do so. And to make the subtext their text, I am mainly digging at the notion of Rule Zero as any kind of salve or curative for a game with actual rules. People freak on the proposed changes to hybrid mana because even if you don't like those rules, you understand that of course everyone will still follow them. And that's exactly the reason why so many people clamor about the change, is that they are coming to terms with that either Rule Zero never actually existed, or that it only exists to ease the weight of responsibility on the format's stewards. You don't have to give people permission to play however they want with the cards they own. And more importantly, the fact they can does not absolve you of the responsibility to clearly define your format and the rules by which everyone abides. That's the entire utility of having a format in the first place. And even if you have personally successfully implemented a Rule Zero change among your playgroup, you'll kindly notice that not everyone wants to spend any portion of their limited time playing games either petitioning or being petitioned to entertain an alternative interpretation of that game, especially after everyone else has spent a decent amount of time and probably money preparing for the version that is already helpfully written and arbitrated by a third party. I don't like the way hybrid mana current works, or color identity in general. I don't like Universes Beyond cards. I don't like cards designed for Commander. I don't like that Emrakul is banned. I don't think land destruction needs to be soft banned. I don't think Aura Shards should be a game changer. It's fun to talk about what changes might make the game more to our liking, and maybe some people are genuinely just having fun talking in circles about hybrid mana. I realized, maybe long ago, but in crystal English language now, that the utility of having rules that everyone can understand and agree to, having rules that no player has to bear responsibility for, is worth much more than the cost of compromise. And compromise in this sense is not a cost at all, rather, it's the freedom to discover something, to surprise yourself, not by giving over control of anything, but by understanding you never had any control to give. I can't stop Magic from being a commodity and an intellectual property, and I can't stop people with spreadsheet jobs from slowly stripping all the copper wiring out of it. But I can still love the parts of the game that I love, and I can tell a story about coming to terms with the rest of it. Like, for example, what's about the last remaining criterion for my deck? How's about my immense distaste for premium card printings? Well, here's about them. Here's what hit me like it was predestined and foretold I would be making this deck someday. It's that Wizards has printed for some pre-releases foils of some cards that have the date stamped on them. And what's going to make you remember what Magic once was more than a season's past that reads 2/3 April 2016 in the bottom right corner of the art? And speaking of ghosts of Magic past, there's one card I feel like I have to talk about in special detail for this deck, and I don't mean card as in the game piece abstract from its physical form, but indeed a singular real card that I personally own and can hold and shuffle and slap down, which is this copy of Eternal Witness that has been in my possession for 21 years at time of writing, purchased from the Meijer in Bowling Green, Ohio as part of 2004's Fifth Dawn's Stampede theme deck, which on its cardboard deck box package has printed Therese Nielsen's Eternal Witness artwork. This Eternal Witness was my second favorite card, which is to say it was the second card to be my favorite one, and not that there was another card I liked more at the time. The card I liked best first was the promo foil Thorn Elemental that came in the 7th edition starter box, the box set that had the CD-ROM game that taught you how to play the game by tapping 4 and then 5 mountains to finish the opponent with Lightning Elemental followed by Lava Axe. But unlike that Thorn Elemental, which was quickly revealed to be an unserious card, Eternal Witness has maintained her presence in my Magic life for as long as I've had this copy. It's been in every version of my cube, and in all the various forms of my green Stompy deck, which is most recently a Xenaghost God of Revel's EDH deck. Truthfully, this card is probably not good enough as a basic green staple for every EDH deck anymore, and it doesn't really align with the deck strategy, at all. But I've never even considered removing it until now, when I had the opportunity to move it to a deck where it will play a much more pivotal role. But Eternal Witness was my favorite card most definitely at first just because of the art, but then also because it's a great card that grew up with my understanding of the game and supported the grindy, toolsy, marginal strategies I came to love. Maybe because I was predispositioned to, and maybe because this card gripped and molded my young mind with this half-naked leaf-clad woman to appreciate card gaming as medium for human fulfillment. And as I describe it now, I guess this is a more artful iteration of the experience what probably kids in the pre-1993 world had with a deck of girly playing cards. But so anyway, Therese Nielsen competes for the spot of second best MTG artist, definitely behind only Rebecca Gay. And as far as I was aware, Therese Nielsen was a basically default answer for lots of other people too, when quizzed on who the best and favorite artist in MTG history was until about 2018, when people started to track that she Twitter followed a bunch of politically objectionable figures and outlets, including Mike Cernovich and InfoWars. And eventually this led to her apologizing, but still in various ways seeming to be interested in / supportive of certain far-right views, and specific the concerns were that she was a transphobe and racist. So eventually in 2020, Wizards of the Coast decided to stop working with her since that was a big year for American companies to take broadly progressive moral stances. In the description, I'll link an article about it if you care for more particulars, but that's about all you need to know for the purpose of this video. What you don't strictly need to know, but may comfort some viewers, is that I have basically the opposite views and beliefs from what Therese Nielsen was seen as having in this situation. So it's certainly frustrating / disappointing to me that this happened. And since I'm still playing cards that she contributed the artwork to, which is likely in some amount of bad taste, let me make especially clear that I don't care that she doesn't work with Wizards of the Coast anymore, because there are plenty of great artists who have the decency and good sense to not either truly believe or appear as though they believe cruel things, who have and will never receive the opportunities she has as an artist. And I am not a member of any group Nielsen supposedly held animosity for, except for maybe just people with left politics in general. So if that makes you not care what my personal opinion on or approach to this matter is, that's also fine, because I'm not saying my opinion out loud since I want or expect anyone watching to treat these matters in the same way I do. I'm actually here so that I can get across what my own one person's relationship is to this particular instance of loving a thing made by a possibly bad person is like, in the hopes that this will be solid entertainment and a thought-provoking thing that people can also discuss and are welcome to view differently for themselves. Since you're around to hear me say this, we can have the common ground that either writing or hearing this be said is some amount worthwhile, and therefore let's just get on with it, since if you're determined to interpret any of what I'm saying uncharitably or simplistically, no amount of qualification will deter you. So this is a roundabout way of stating that I am supportive of those who feel uncomfortable with the continued presence of her artwork in a game they love, just as I'm supportive of those who feel frustrated or annoyed or maybe even disgusted when they go to a museum and there's paintings there by like Lucian Freud, who was genuinely a huge piece of shit in ways that are even kind of part of his art. Because I also go to a lot of museums, and I like Lucian Freud's paintings pretty well, and have liked them for longer than I knew much of his shortcomings as far as being a decent human is concerned. But there are lots of artists who didn't have the fortune to be liked by me before I knew they were really awful, or who I just don't like the art of and also happen to be awful. And I feel a little something of disgust when I have to see their artwork exhibited in reverence of its quality. This will complicate everything you want to enjoy if you let it, but also I get why it does sometimes get in the way. I'm a fan of the football team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and if you know anything about the recent history of that franchise, it might be that their quarterback from 2004 to 2021 was credibly accused of sexual assault. This accusation occurred after that quarterback, Ben Roethlisberger, had won 2 championships with the Steelers, and viewing and celebrating these victories was a memorable moment in my childhood, and something I'm deeply grateful to have felt, because lots and lots of people go their whole lives waiting to see the sports team they like reach that mountaintop. And I don't remember exactly when or how I found out about Roethlisberger's being such a vile person, but I do know that it was a factor in my drifting away from football for about a decade after, before finally getting back to really loving the sport again as an adult since his retirement. Now, was this a moral victory for me or any other kind of victory? Because it's basically just my asceticism, since Roethlisberger is exactly as living a consequence-free life without me having watched him do so for a while. Plenty of people watched him play the whole time, and I don't feel judgmental about it, because realistically, based on the profile of professional athletes in major sports as being guarded and pampered toxic masculine exemplars a lot of the time, I would guarantee that every single team in the NFL rosters at least one person at a time who's some manner of heinous criminal, or at least 2 at a time in the case of the Baltimore Ravens. The go-to quote regarding NFL teams' standards for personal conduct is that if Hannibal Lecter ran a 4.3, they'd say he had an eating disorder. But the point is that my inability to watch the rest of Roethlisberger's tenure with the Steelers only means I was uncomfortable not being able to sufficiently suppress this reality, since he was the franchise player, the quarterback, the captain, the face of the team, and apparently, as long as it isn't shoved right in my face all the time, I'm still happy to forget any of this on game day. And I don't bring this up strictly as an act of self-flagellation, because it's instead more to say that you can run a similar exercise with more or less serious transgressions for basically anything you do in life. So if you want to find any uncomplicated solace anywhere, really, you're going to need to learn to separate the sign and signifier to some extent. Making that separation can be more or less difficult depending on, for example, whether you're having to feel an active support of a person themselves, as in the case of rooting for an athlete on a sports team, or if you're instead just appreciating something they made, like a book or a painting or a song. By this metric, a card game artist should be one of the easiest to come to terms with, because of course there's so little direct interface with the artist as a person other than that tiny credit at the bottom of the card. And there are so many others involved in the design and creation of the card in the context of the game that it exists in, that it's theoretically pretty ignorable. And I would guess that most players aren't aware of anything about Therese Nielsen's departure, and even those who are just mostly accept it as an unfortunate fact of the game. Especially since Wizards has ceased commissioning new art or reprinting any of her previous works, it's easy enough to say that what needed to be done is done and we're safe to move on now. Still, there's plenty of ambiguity about how exactly we're supposed to handle all of this as players. If I went to watch a Pittsburgh Steelers game while Ben Roethlisberger was still playing quarterback for the team, there's a reasonable guarantee that basically all the other Steelers fans at the stadium have arrived at the same conclusion that we're okay suspending what we understand him to be as a person in favor of what he represents on the football field. In the post-that-guy world, that's no longer guaranteed, but he's gone anyway, so it's sort of beside the point. If I play a game of Magic, there's no such guarantee that the other players will or won't be happy to do the same thing for whatever objectionable artists whose work is on the cards in my deck. Magic is a game and it's social and participatory, and it makes individual players own cards like this Eternal Witness. These are some of the most widely distributed physical art prints of all time, in fact. And they don't just go on your wall or stay in your binder, but you play with these art prints and manipulate them and create through play with other people in association of what these cards look like and what they mean. I want to create through belief a world where players are in charge of that, and it's enough to transcend the imperfection and naughtiness of all sausage making. I think some reasonable discomfort about Therese Nielsen's artwork is basically orthodoxy for non-assholes who play this game, but there are certainly other weirdo MTG artists, and some who are obviously much worse and more harmful people than even the worst imagined version of Nielsen. But also Nielsen is probably just the right combination of having a number of cards that are super iconic for the game and being one of the most liked artists historically, and then committing just a bad enough sin that it can't be massively ignored. Noah Bradley, for instance, is a disgusting human for reasons similar to Ben Roethlisberger, but how many relevant cards did he make the most iconic art for? The closest thing to a staple is probably Into the Triome, and I have no faith I could describe anything about the art for that card from memory, despite my being the exact kind of freak who regularly oversteps on picking Triomes in Cube Draft. I can't name a single card in any of my EDH decks that I know for sure has art by Bradley, and I hope none of them do. Nielsen, on the other hand, holds the original versions of Eternal Witness, Rhystic Study, Force of Will, Factor Fiction, Life from the Loam, Dismember, Essence Warden, Natural Order, Rest in Peace, Echo of Aeons, Magus of the Candelabra, Visions of Beyond, and Enter the Infinite, as well as probably the second most iconic art for Swords to Plowshares and also Mother of Runes. These are cards for which there is no Magic the Gathering the way I know it without, and I might not like it, but for me, Nielsen's associated illustrations are a significant portion of that collectively revered symbol power which I was talking about earlier. There's no way around this is what Eternal Witness looks like. And I don't want to accept the version of Magic where we let individuals, no matter how instrumental they are to the creation of a card as we know it, rob us of the card's meaning. I myself am a painter, and I put my paintings in the background of my videos because I'm proud of them and I think they give something nice to look at while I'm going on and on. Like a lot of people who make things, I've gone through lots of periods of insecurity about my art and my skills, and the reason I'm spending a lot of my time and money and focus working on this thing that no one else really seems to care about usually. And like a lot of artists, one of the answers I had for a long time was that I was just making art for myself, which I will tell you now from a perspective of having a bit more confidence, that this is pure childish coping. It's a reflexive way of insulating yourself from acknowledging that you are falling short of what you mean to accomplish, and defying that you can just decide that your art is good because yours is the only opinion that matters. I understand that you just have to do this sometimes to make it through as an artist, but that is why it happens. The point of visual art is that it gets looked at, and that it goes out and interfaces with the rest of the visual world and other people's minds, and starts to create some kind of meaning. Even I, making these one-of-one oil paintings that don't even get exhibited anywhere but like Instagram and the backgrounds of these videos, know that what the art actually means is what the audience, real or imagined, is going to do with it once I'm done making it. So to me, an artist making a commissioned illustration to be produced ad nauseum on a trading card is not necessarily the authority on what that piece's life is going to be once it makes it out of the studio. And I don't mean this in a general death of the author way, because actually it's that Therese Nielsen only cared about drawing the art for Eternal Witness insofar as she was getting paid to make it and given some sort of prompt to follow, and she wanted to do a good job for her own pride and fulfillment and to continue getting illustration work. She wasn't wrong for having that approach, but you and I play Magic the Gathering cards as much as we can because we love playing with them, and that's probably the only reason. Eternal Witness is part of the game to me, and to lots of other people, and it belongs to the game of Magic in a much more profound way than it does to Therese Nielsen. Just as Magic belongs metaphysically more to the players than it does to Wizards of the Coast. So, I'm glad that this Eternal Witness exists, and I'm glad it has this artwork. I don't want to let Therese Nielsen diminish this game and take away bits of history, and more precisely to turn this card here into merely an object of history, and not a focus to channel the divinity of play. There's basically an endless conversation about this exact same problem, so of course there's no perfect answer. But anyway, even if this discussion gets tiring, there does need to be a way for each of us to deal with having to know so much about where your products, cultural or otherwise, come from, and what you're going to do to feel okay with that or not. And what's more relevant than what I want is what's actually happening, which is that we Magic players have demonstrated that we either don't want to or cannot forget what this card is. In the cruel metric of dollar bills, this fact is recorded, that Eternal Witness's 5th Dawn foil printing's price has 2.5 times multiplied since Therese Nielsen was professionally dissociated from Magic, remaining far away more expensive and sought after than any of the various secret layer, box topper, hollow foil, full art treatments the card has been subjected to without her artwork. So there has to be at least some recognition of the fact that Nielsen's wrong thinking is concretely interpreted as relevant to Magic, the game, mostly in that it puts a cap on the supply for the certified authentic copies of symbols she's responsible for. And that's kind of gross to think about, and it makes me glad that I can at least decide to only want the one I'm holding right now. The one who remembers me before I had to remember what her illustrator was like, when I was 7 years old enough to not think about how there was a person who drew the picture on the card, and whose name is irreversibly stamped in the bottom left corner. The one who remembers me when I was 8 and then 11 years old, watching the Steelers win the Super Bowl draped in my Ben Roethlisberger jersey. The one who remembers me when I liked Yu-Gi-Oh! Better than Magic because the cards looked cool. The one who remembers me when I could see nothing beyond that sacred symbol. She's my witness, and I'm hers. This Beledros deck is likely quite bad, and more importantly, it's really against every instinct I have as a Magic player, but I set out to commit to this thing that is totally apart from the goal of actually winning a game, and now it's assembled here in my hand in authentic cardboard. As I was putting the deck together for real, I made a few other snap decisions to complement the aesthetic threads already present. Perhaps most significantly, I decided I would construct the mana base solely from basic lands. This is not a cost-cutting measure at all. I have sitting in my binder a set of relevant fixing and utility lands for this deck, but I wanted to do something more to recall the kitchen table essentialism that many of us look back on fondly. These are just some whatever mismatched basics I pulled from a shoebox, underscoring, hopefully, a sense of innocence, either lost or sublimated. One of the reasons I wanted to make this thematic and experiential deck is so that I would have something new to show off when I visit my hometown for the holidays, and will have the chance to play a lot of in-person Magic for the first time in about 2 years. And even 2 years ago, my friends and I were not really playing Magic in the same way we are now. Most of us had really fallen off the game, at least as far as playing EDH together. I never really stopped playing Magic, but that's because I just grind limited on Arena by myself. Per my last video, I would say that the last 6 months are the most I've ever sought out and enjoyed playing EDH, even though it's all had to take place over the internet using Spell Table or MTGO. I strongly feel that this deck cannot, or at least should not, be played except for at a physical table, in the presence of good friends and festive drink. Seeing these exact paper cards is important, not just a blurry, pixely mark of them on the computer screen. And apart from the artsy pretensions I've detailed in this video, Mindslaver effects are notoriously annoying to sequence and play out over something like Spell Table. And the only win con of this deck is doing that a bunch of times in a row. So at this point, I maybe need to see what actually happens when I try to play the deck. I'm leaving soon to visit home for the holidays, and I am going to take this deck on a maiden voyage when I get there and see my friends all together and in person for the first time since I found this new spark in the ashes of the EDH format. I'll let you know how it goes in some form, but how could it be anything other than wonderful, regardless of how good or bad this deck ends up? To anyone watching, I hope you find even a speck of the gamer's solace this holiday season too, and I'll see you in the new year, where we take Magic in, both as it is and as we know it can be, in equal measure. Thank you, and have a wonderful holiday.